Leila was 7 years old, in a child's world, when everything was simple and understandable. There were mornings when she woke up in her room with colorful murals, always with the reassuring voice of her mother. Her face shone with the confidence she felt when she held her mother's hand tightly. Her world was safe. And the world was always the same, just as it was every morning when she woke up and looked at the same window. But that morning, something had changed. The hours were interrupted by the sound of an explosion. At first the explosion sounded like an echo in his ears, and then everything suddenly began to break. The windows shook, the walls creaked as if they were about to collapse. Leila wrapped her doll in her arms and retreated to the corner. It was as if every aspect of the air had turned against them. As her eyes slid out through the first crack in the window, she felt everything disappear. The war was this moment, and the war felt like a silent storm in the middle of everything. She saw her mother embracing Leila in a panic. Her mother, the woman who had always been calm and reassuring, now harbored something lost in her eyes. At that moment, a fear fell into Leila's heart. Her mother's strong hands, this time not to defend her, were afraid of losing her. For a moment, she believed that all was lost. "Mom, what's happening?" she asked, but her mother only hugged her tighter. The war was not just an explosion outside. The war had entered the house. In all the rooms, in the cracks in the roof, in the leaks in the walls, in the fear in her eyes. Leila realized that her mother had never let go of her hand again. Those fingers were anxious, not safe like before. "Where are we going?" she asked, but her mother said nothing. Her mother was dragging them quickly outside, while the whole world was unraveling before her eyes. Even her favorite tree was falling down in the garden at the corner of their house. It was as if the tree was a symbol of Leila's trust, and now it had fallen. At that moment, something broke in Leila's soul. She held her favorite doll, but after a while it slipped away. In a destroyed world, there was nothing left. In the background, the noise of bombs, screams, and the sound of breaking glass mingled. Leila felt an emptiness in the midst of all that noise. It was like a fear that settled in her heart as she squeezed her mother's hand. They moved away from the corner of their house, but the town still left a trace behind them. Broken houses, burnt fields, everything was in a state of collapse. The war was not only outside, it had taken up residence inside everything. As Leila walked through the streets, she looked with a chill she had never seen before. People she had never met were running in panic. Fear was around every corner. Leila tried to look into her mother's eyes, but her mother's eyes, once full of trust, were now filled with frustration. "Mom, I'm scared. Single quote said Leila, but her mother didn't answer. The answer was never going to be given. Because at that moment, the war had begun not only in the outside world, but also in her mother's heart. The safe world had suddenly disappeared, and Leila was nothing more than a part of that lost world. While holding her mother's hand tightly, Leila was thinking about the lost world. That moment settled in the heart of a child who, for years to come, would never fully understand the meaning of war. Ever since she and her mother had set off together, Leila had hoped that everything would pass. But with every step, something else was lost. The town where their home had been was left behind, like a distant dream. The war had left only broken walls and deserted streets. Leila's eyes were empty as everything she had once trusted was erased. Almost every day a new pain was added to this void. One day, when Leila and her mother were almost fainting from hunger and exhaustion, they met a group of refugees they did not recognize while walking on the road. The tiredness on their faces and the hopelessness in their eyes turned into a kind of fear that squeezed Leila's heart. People were walking in the dark, falling behind each other, with no time to look up at the sky. Everyone seemed to be thinking only of taking one more step, of surviving. Leila, holding her mother's hand tightly, didn't know who to approach. No one stopped to help her and her mother, and all she knew was to hear her mother's voice. "Let's stay together," her mother said, but Leila could hear something missing in her mother's voice. The old, safe tone was gone, replaced by fear and despair. In the darkness that surrounded them, Leila felt like she was alone in an alien world. As they walked along the road, the sound of explosions from the nearby town still rang in her ears. In another place, in another country, in another life, Leila would always remember those sounds. Because the war left a mark not only outside, but also inside. One day, while walking, they took shelter under a bridge. The place where they spent the night between their mother and children was surrounded by a fearful silence. Leila's eyes flickered in the weak light, but the fear in them told her that everything that had once been was gone, perhaps never to be brought back. "Don't ever leave me, okay?" her mother said, looking into Leila's eyes. Leila had never heard the fear in her mother's voice before. At that moment, there was not only love in her mother's eyes, there was a fear of being lost. But Leila did not want to take her hand away from her mother's hand. Darkness enveloped the whole world outside, but Leila held her mother's hand tightly, trying to find a light in the darkness. That night, Leila couldn't sleep. She felt the emptiness inside her more and more. On the one hand, she had lost the last traces of her childhood. On the other, there was hope and the will to survive. The war had destroyed people, but hope still lingered in Leila. She had lost her identity, but she had learned to survive. On this path, she was getting lost a little more with each step, but she was growing a little more. In a way that only a child can carry, she was trying to rebuild everything in the world with the confidence she once had. Leila and her mother had arrived in a new country, but not everything was as they expected. A new life, a new language, unfamiliar faces. All of these things were imprinted in a child's heart like the depths of an unfamiliar world. At that moment, Leila could only hold her mother's hand, which felt like a safe harbor in this strange world. But there was another lostness in her mother's eyes. They were not the eyes of the mother Leila used to know. She found it difficult to recognize them. In the first days, Leila realized that everything was different. The sun was never as bright as it was at home. People moved too fast and did not even greet each other. The new language was a foreign melody. Leila did not understand how the words were ordered, but she felt the emptiness in the way someone else looked at her. One morning, her mother took her to a park. Leila saw children running and playing, but the joyful laughter was not familiar to her. The boys' laughter could not help her forget the frightening echoes of the war. Everything was foreign, but sometimes a child lives with only a little hope. Leila watched the strange boys around her and was suddenly filled with a desire to join them. She took a step, but then stepped back. She had lost her identity in a world whose language she did not understand. No one said welcome to her, but he tried anyway. In the evening that day, at dinner with her mother, there was a strange silence. Leila realized that her mother's once loving eyes had been replaced by a deep tiredness. Mothers sometimes had to fight too hard for their own children. She was lost in this new world. But in the midst of all that was lost, Leila felt the hope that one day she would find that old sparkle in her mother's eyes. Because war made people lose, but hope was never lost. One day, her mother began to read Leila a fairy tale in her own language. Leila remembered her mother's old voice. It reassured her. The war had not brought them together, but the warmth of her mother's voice had lit a light in Leila's heart. A light of hope, perhaps filtered through the traces of the past. Leila closed her eyes and imagined that somewhere in this world, too, there was a place that felt like home. Slowly, she began to slip into another world, perhaps that old town, perhaps a happier time. But no matter what, there was hope. As time passed, the change in Leila began to be noticed. One day, when she went to the park, she sat next to a boy. The boy smiled at her, and when Leila began to speak in a foreign language, his smile grew wider. At that moment, Leila realized everything could be lost, but survival and smiling could always remain inside a person. Even a language was a path that could pass from one heart to another. In this world, even if they were strangers, people somehow understood each other. And in her new world, with a fresh start, Leila could hope again. The fact that everything seemed lost was only the beginning. Perhaps the future could be built on hope.